very much. Well, it's great to be here, and thank you to all of you for coming at this time of year, which seems to be a kind of relentless cycle of organisation and implementation of Christmas activities. And thank you to Katie Warrener and her, for her ever cheerful work with her team in putting this event on. You've just heard some of my career highlights, and for me it's a real career highlight to be here this evening in front of many colleagues and friends who I've admired for a long time. As you just heard as well, I am an alumnus of the Royal College of Art, but as someone with an interest in edges and peripheries and margins, I've always felt that Brighton was where the action was. But having arrived here, 3 years ago at least, I'm still in this interesting edge situation. I was talking with Professor Anne Boddington a few months ago, and I was telling her what a happy ship I found the University of Brighton was. But I added that I tend to be bobbing around in a lifeboat somewhere off it because I'm based at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I'll come back later on to briefly talk about some of the work I'm doing here. The University of Brighton is a place also where the history of design as an academic discipline has been pioneered, particularly by the work of Professor Jonathan Woodham. And I really think that design history here at the University of Brighton offers a very interesting kind of third way. Design history, yes, it is a academic discipline in its own right, but also it is one of those very important parts of studio learning as well. But also I think design history here at Brighton has shown that there are other ways that design historians can contribute professionally to society. And that's about engaging critically with the world, and particularly the contemporary world. Now, engaging with the contemporary world is sometimes quite a challenging task, particularly if you, like me, you're often missing things. For example, in March 1990, I happened to miss the Trafalgar Square poll tax riot, which practically brought down Margaret Thatcher's prime ministership later on, because I went to St James's Park for an ice cream. So often, if you're a follower of contemporary history or the contemporary moment, you're often in the wrong place, or you had other priorities, at least in this case. So I always advocate a kind of deep hanging out with contemporary history. For example, you might not get that invitation to the art exhibition of the century, but you might read about it in the events section of your magazines. So you can begin to pick up the repercussions and the ripples. You begin to see how new outlooks, knowledge, skills, objects, technologies, ways of doing things unfold through multiple channels and in diverse ways. And this is how I've come to notice and define a thing called design culture. So, as a professor of design culture, I better define it for you in some way. There are actually 3 of us in the world at the moment, professors of design culture. We're going to get together sometime, a bit like the 3 tenors. I suppose I have can take some of the blame in sort of developing this field, mostly through my book, The Culture of Design, which first came out in 2000, but has come out in other iterations, and a third, a revised edition, is out hopefully just before Christmas, so get it on your lists. But back to what design culture is. Well, firstly, I think we can think about it as a descriptive term. It's something which policymakers, critics, journalists and curators increasingly talk about. They talk about the design culture of a place rather than more straightforwardly its design. And by this I take it that they mean what design is done and what it means in these places, not just for designers but more broadly in society. So in this talk, I'm going to be presenting design culture as a thing made up of a set of qualities. But secondly, I'm going to present it hopefully as a kind of analytical tool, a way of describing or drilling down into what's happening in front of us. But hopefully, towards the end of the talk, I'm going to be talking about design culture also about a way of generating new practices, new sensibilities. But back to the relationship of design culture and design history. Well, I think design culture as an academic field of study shares a lot with design history, but perhaps has a different emphasis. The first thing about design culture studies is that they seriously and resolutely focus on the contemporary. By that I mean the right now. Secondly, design culture collapses design disciplines. In other words, we're not necessarily interested in graphic design or industrial design or interior design or other forms of professional design in themselves in isolation. Instead, we tend to talk about or think about and investigate scenarios. So we might be investigating a form of leisure, a neighbourhood, or an online community. And these scenarios are made up of things like hotels, streets, or computers. But they're also made up of communication, like signage, instruction manuals, or graphical interfaces. But they also need people. The third thing about design culture, very resolutely again, is that we see it as a social practice. By this, we mean that we are interested in what design means in society. How is it functioning? How is it used and been acted upon? And within this, I've been concerned to champion thinking around consumption that goes beyond the individual, beyond the private, and thinks about consumption as a public participatory process and act. Fourthly, and this gets onto a diagram which probably some of you might have seen before, we're interested then in the relationships between what designers do, how design is produced. By that I don't just mean manufacture, but channels of distribution, forms of advertising, marketing and so on, how it's consumed in everyday life, and we're interested in the relationships of those activities with the images, objects and spaces of design. But more importantly, we're interested in the relationships between these things, what goes on in those lines. Okay, so it's very much interested in relationality. Now, to repeat, design history sometimes does these things too, but not always. And design culture at least tries to do these things all of the time. Later on, I'm going to be talking about an area of design culture which perhaps design history doesn't do at all, which is not a criticism of design history, just a way of flagging up some difference. So, here's a route map for my talk. It's divided after this introduction into four sections. Firstly, I'm going to trace the origins of design culture as being specific to a particular phase of history, showing that its emergence is deeply entwined with particular qualities of late capitalism. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the contradictions that this produces within design practice itself. And this is where the zombies and pirates motif, or pirates and zombies, they're interchangeable, by the way. This is where the motif appears, and the zombies and pirates are going to pop up at various times in this lecture. Thirdly, I want to draw on some of my own encounters and practices in design culture, suggesting how by thinking about design culture itself as an object, we can reorientate dominant commercial approaches for social benefit. And then finally, I'm going to just finish off with some further questions we might think about in coming at this design culture idea. So the first half of my talk, the main body of my talk, is really about commercial design and commercial design in the past. And then the second half kind of reorientates this to a kind of looking forward. So what I want to do is argue that this idea of design culture is a concept that really belongs to our times, but it's useful to trace its origins in order to understand its qualities. Now, sometimes events in history create an accelerated set of changes. I think there are some key historical dates of the 20th century, like 1907, like 1972, like 1957, in which there was a kind of very important confluence of technological, social, political, economic, and so on, events which brought about a kind of cognitive shift. So, for example, John Berger, in his wonderful book, The Success and Failure of Picasso, points out how all these amazing things happened in 1907 or thereabouts. And Cubism, of course. So it signals some sort of change in the way the world was seen and interpreted and indeed represented. Now I want to say let's hear it for 1986, because I think 1986 was a year or thereabouts, a year which produced the conditions, I think, that have led to what we now have as this contemporary design culture situation. Now, 1986 was the year in which the finance system in the UK and the US and throughout much of Western Europe was deregulated. It was also the year in which the stock exchange moved to on-screen interchanges, the sort of electrification, if you like, of the stock exchange. It was also the year in which, at least in the US, services overtook manufacture as the dominant part of the US economy. So there's part of the rise of the service economy, particularly in the UK and the US. And indeed, along with these kinds of changes, for example, Fitch redesigned the Midland Bank to make it look perhaps more like a discotheque than that rather intimidating place you had to go and put a tie on to go and see your bank manager to get a loan or something. Banks became sort of outward-facing, friendly experiences, offering all kinds of new financial products. Round about 1986 also is the time where the TV remote finds its way into the marketplace, promising a kind of greater interaction with that green-eyed monster in the corner of the room. It's also 1986 was that the Filofax, the personal organizer, increased markedly on the market in the marketplace, a tool for planning and systemization of our everyday lives. 1985-86 was also when the Nintendo games entertainment system came onto the market, and Super Mario and a whole new golden age of video games design took root. And I think just in terms of how does this work as a part of this cognitive shift? If you think about video games as being episodic, but also working within very tight time frames, with very clearly defined goals, there's something changing here in terms of the way we sort of use and interact and think about things. Back to a picture we've already seen. This is Nigel Coates's design for Cafe Bongo in Tokyo of the same year, which turned interior design into theatre, a space where narratives and stories unfold. It's also the year of the big bubble in design as well, and this was marked in particular by the establishment of the weekly design magazine Design Week in September of that year. And its founder-editor, Jeremy Myerson, told me that there were two things very important about this magazine. The first thing, that it was the first weekly magazine, and the second thing was the small ads in the back, tens and or hundreds of small ads in the back, which meant that design consultancies could hire at short notice, could put teams together very quickly in order to work on very short-term projects. So this is where the design industry in the UK goes into overdrive. It's also the beginning for the design industry of a kind of change in the way that it was beginning to work, where let's call it the profit motive, the idea of cost centres within design consultancies became increasingly important. Of course, design and creativity are about light bulb moments. But design is also about careful planning and systemization. And in about 2009, I edited a book which looked at this other side of design. So these are cost calculations for a design company in Canada, showing the roles of each member of the studio against weekly income. So on the one hand, this is a mechanism for management and control. On the other, it also demonstrates a measure of professional organisation within the studio. It is a tool for justifying to clients the fees that are asked of them for the delivery of projects. It also ensures deployment within a firm towards meeting deadlines. So there's a profound cognitive shift, as I've already said. Just as in 1907, Picasso's development of Cubism channeled a new way of viewing the world, influenced by developments as diverse as physics, psychoanalysis, economics, travel and film. So in 1986, or thereabouts, another big leap was being taken forward. And these all add up to a new or different culture of design. This isn't about the world of good design or beautiful edifying forms as agreed by committees, national institutions or university professors. Here design takes on a different quality. It's about new forms of interaction. It's about time-based narratives. It's about the speeding up of processes, of finding ways to bringing designers and clients or producers closer together. It's not about the individual objects of design for contemplation, but the orchestration of visual and material things to create various discrete environments. And it's also about tracking procedures, about discrete and fragmented activities. So we've talked about these qualities. What about the quantities? Well, let me just show you a set of graphs which show the growth of design in various parts of the world over the last 15 or 20 years. And you'll see that there is a very kind of pleasing upward curve on these graphs. I'm going to show them without comment. But here's another astonishing graph. This is the graph of membership of the Chartered Society of Designers put together by my colleague Lara Armstrong. And you'll see that the graph peaks round about 1986 and then falls away. It seems almost counterintuitive, this. As the number of designers in the UK continues to grow, membership of the Chartered Society of Designers seems to fall away. Now, why is this? Well, one might be that the Chartered Society of Designers represented a kind of old school, sort of a very industrial design focused kind of organisation, which became increasingly irrelevant to many designers because, of course, from the 1980s, we've got these very standard types of design going on. But as the 80s progress and the 90s and so on, we find more and more other sectors of design emerging. So what this is a story of, I suppose, is increased fragmentation of the design industry rather than it being brought together under any particular sort of normative rules or processes or anything like that. So when you look at other design institutions, associations, professional bodies, we just find them proliferating across the world. And these are mostly on a regional basis rather than, let's say, on national or pan-national bases. So design is lots of things, but it's also design is about the design of design itself. In other words, as many of you know, designers are constantly looking for new ways of practicing, new kinds of clients, new kinds of publics, new ways of using technologies, and so on. So this perhaps explains this kind of constant fragmentation of the design industry and its constant lack, let's say, of normative rules or ways of doing it, unlike, say, law or architecture or other professional areas. Now, of course, designers or design consultancies or studios increasingly create their own normative processes. In other words, they have ways of explaining to clients, what is it do you actually get as a client of us? What process shall we take you through? And I think this is increasingly evident. And it's also a way of differentiating designers and design studios from each other. It's a way of saying, if you come and be our client, you'll get an experience which is going to be differentiated, different from working with this other studio down the road, and so on. Let us demonstrate our awesomeness through the design process. These are tactics of reassurance. But there's a basic problem here. The culture of design is often a unity of differences. It's made up of lots of individualized and differentiated interests and ways of doing things. And broadly, this is where this idea of zombies and pirates kicks in. On the one hand, there are systems for designers and design clients that are formulated to help manage the design process. They allow commercial designers to stumble zombie-like from one project to another, responding to whatever comes along. They are essentially reactive to the marketplace. And alternatively, there are the pirates. They roam the world, plundering ideas, putting new combinations together, reinventing themselves, and what they do, finding new territories to exploit, new islands with buried treasure. And this latter image of the designer, the pirate image, is much more attractive than being perhaps a zombie designer. At least there isn't a slime trail. Instead, things are left in their wake as the pirate designer moves quickly through the hell and high water of boom and recession, reinventing themselves, challenging how design might be done and what it's for. This also plays into the more avant-gardist art school notion of the designer. And of course, rule breaking and disruption have been a common theme, particularly within the art school tradition, to make a rather obvious point. But of course, sometimes a self-proclaimed aspiration to radicalism can be very hollow. Sometimes, though, it produces refreshing and magical and challenging outlooks. But whether we're talking about zombie or pirate design, one thing binds them, and that is a sense of forward movement. Now, naturally, designers make future forms and are interested in the future. Indeed. So let us briefly put this back into the economic context of neoliberalism of the last 30 years and see where this fragmentation and forward orientation of design fits in. Now, I've mentioned this word deregulation already. In relation to financial institutions, where the rigid rules of banking that had evolved in the 19th century were stripped away by Thatcherism and Reaganomics. But deregulation has worked in other ways. One way has been in the disaggregation of manufacturing and service structures, so in other words, outsourcing of manufacturing and services and so on. But let me give you another example. When my mother was a primary school teacher in Devon for most of her career, the school was run through a straightforward direct relationship with its local authority, education authority. Pens, paper, school furniture, cleaning, school dinners, payroll and so on were supplied directly by the local education authority. In the latter stages of her career, from the late 1980s, the procurement of school services began to look more like this. So, nearly everything coming to school, and nearly all its services were outsourced to various agencies, private companies, but sometimes not-for-profit agencies as well. And this is, as we know, is very much how the public sector has moved through this period of neoliberalism. And of course, we've got the sort of gigantic service providers like Accenture and Capita who've been increasingly dominant in this. So what does this result in? This results in more companies, more logos, more auditing, more best practice, documents to monitor service, deliver quality, and so on. Thus, design gets implicated again into new forms of bureaucracy and enterprise. Now, this very much emerged in the 1980s. In the 1990s, we can think about it as the decade of the new economy, the economy of better, faster, cheaper, the use of sweatshops and digital procurement laced together by warehouses, shipping containers, motorways, the global infrastructure, which we all very well know. This is, in essence, a speeding up of delivery while driving costs down. And this also impacts on designers as well, increasing time pressure to deliver projects, as probably many of you well know. Indeed, the Design Industry Voices surveys of the last 3 years has reported consistently that designers complain of the current burden to turn around design projects in ever shorter timeframes for less money. And indeed, the design industry itself becoming increasingly deregularized with the use of freelancers and interns to cut costs. But of course, lacking a significant and unified professional voice, it's practically impossible for the design industry to do much about this. The third pillar, let's call it, of neoliberalism I want to talk about is this thing called financialization. It's a descriptor that emerged particularly from the year 2000. Within this, we find the dominance of the management of capital assets among institutions and companies. A chief focus of financialization is the search for or creation of future sources of value. So stock market entrepreneurs and merchant bankers make predictions on what commodities or corporations might be worth in the coming years, months, days, or hours, and invest accordingly. Likewise, and this is, I think, a very little researched or understood area, design functions as a tool to signal or produce sources of future financial value. So, for example, smartphones are designed and manufactured not just in accordance with consumer cycles, but sometimes at specific points in the financial year to impress company shareholders. Urban design can be used strategically to signal future developments. Often the buildings don't just house people or actions, they can be remortgaged to release more money into the global flows of finance. And finally, the Ford Motor Company makes more money through providing loans to people so that they can buy their cars than through the selling the cars themselves. So this calls into question, well, what is the design object, of course? Of course, people have to be attracted to buying or investing in these things, and this is where design kicks in, of course. So, here we have the three pillars of neoliberalism that in turn mean that design has become a differentiated or fragmented affair guided by tightly organised but atomised structures that encourage speed, and it's also resolutely forward-looking. Indeed, even last night I was at a book launch, book called Design Transitions, and the discussion event was all about the future of design, this kind of almost fixation, I suppose, of design with its own future, and probably understandably so. So in this third section, I want to talk about design culture then as a practice and think about how we can sort of harness this idea of fragmentation and forward movement and also this notion of the pirates and the zombies towards other kinds of activities. How can we reorientate these things, this which is happening and is with us? Now, neoliberalism is not so much a fixed system, but a process of continual transformation. Productive resources and new markets are sought in an ongoing search for new sources of value, and likewise, the culture of design moves with this. So I'm going to give 4 examples of practice which kind of works with this, which I've kind of encountered. So, sometimes the money runs out. And this happened spectacularly when I was living in Leeds in the year 2007, where its rampant property development industry collapsed in on itself. Now, the property development industry had been a very strong motor for the city's economic regeneration from the 1990s right through the 2000s. And whilst economists in 2008 and 2009 were saying, oh, this global financial crash, we couldn't have foreseen it. Well, we saw it in Leeds happening around us in 2006, 2007. But this property development was a generator for income for the city, which also supported, albeit in very limited ways, its poorer margins. With this financial system in the city seriously broken, I got involved in a company we set up to develop and prototype alternative forms for urban regeneration, thinking about, well, what's going to happen now there's no money or none of the urban regeneration processes that the cities relied on can no longer be financed. We are a mixed group made up of Katie Hill, who's now doing a PhD here in Brighton, an architect, a public arts curator, an urban agriculture expert, and 2 geographers. And I grew an activist beard that year. So we set about taking on a project, in a long-term project, mapping underused resources in the suburb of Richmond Hill. Now, Richmond Hill, which you can see ringed in red there, was a neighbourhood of some 17,000 inhabitants that included high indices of poverty, long-term unemployment and transitory groups. And we specifically focused on the skills, particularly non-official, non-certificated ones, social relationships and underused land and resources in the neighbourhood. We are interested in the hidden assets, the stuff which is on the margins. So we wanted to demonstrate how these hidden assets could be nurtured in order to make the neighbourhood more resilient to economic fluctuations outside it, not least in the context of long-term recession, climate change and resource scarcity. So this isn't urban regeneration through the provision of fancy new paving schemes or the creation of new innovation centres. We were interested in identifying and articulating what was already there and returning this to the neighbourhood for its inhabitants to then subsequently use. So let me just show you some of our work. And we used a whole range of methods, from photography to storytelling through to social mapping, historical research, design auditing, and then, as I said, every 2 months we'd return this to citizens in the neighbourhood. So to return to this design culture diagram I showed you earlier, in some ways this the schema maps onto what we are trying to do. Let me show it in some ways visually by looking at resources, social networks and skills. And diving deeply into these 3 areas and then seeing how this actually, the actual physical resources, the physical look of the neighbourhoods worked within these as well. Now, I spoke of the forward orientation of neoliberalism and of design, and in a way our work took the same attitude. We were also interested in discovering and leveraging future sources of value, but our motivations went beyond financialization. This is design activism, not reactive design. It's also about citizens' own perceptions of the neighbourhoods and their lives and how they were expressed, what materialised from these, and clarifying what their aspirations were. There's a kind of layered understanding of the interactions of design, albeit not necessarily in its professional format, the workings of productive activities and everyday life. This is also where zombie and pirate design come together. We were funded by the Regional Development Agency, and so we're involved in continual reporting and tracking and auditing of our project in a kind of zombie-like way, if you like. But we're also pirates in the sense that we were not bound by traditional procedures of this kind of work, inventing our own working and research methods as we went along as appropriate to what we discovered. So in design terms, I like to think of us as not working within a design field, but working as a kind of small holding, a bringing together of different motivations and interests and skills and professions, if you like. A bit like different beasts and plants brought together in a cyclical and intensive assemblage. Now, practicing design culture in the 21st century involves hybridity then, or as our colleague Professor Cheryl Buckley might term it, interdisciplinary bliss. It requires a fusion of zombie and pirate practices, as I've just said, but it also needs us to think of publics in different ways. And this is where people are not necessarily treated as end users, but as having various roles and lives. So a second example I want to talk about was something I saw 2 months ago in Buenos Aires. Whilst I was there, I was invited to visit a studio called Cooperativa de Diseño. We got to them arriving at this factory, ignore the tourist in the front of it, and found our way through these vast halls of abandoned machinery inside. But there were some corners of this massive factory which were still being used. And eventually, in a small recess of the factory, I discovered this design studio, Cooperativa de Diseño, made up of 7 women. Now, Cooperativa de Diseño practice what I call horizontalism. They have a particular focus on working with campaign groups, with political groups, women's groups, creating sort of communications and other visual forms for them. But they also design products for factories where there have been worker takeovers, of which there are many in Argentina. So what they're doing is attending to the entire human ecology of designers, producers and consumers and what goes on between them. They're not necessarily just thinking vertically in terms of designing something, getting manufactured, then to market to users and so on. They're also thinking about designing for the dignity of the people that make the products as well. And theirs is not a rushed kind of process. It's slow-moving husbandry of different needs. And this indeed includes themselves. Earlier in the week, I had spoken at a conference in Buenos Aires where I showed them this schema, which I showed you earlier, from this Canadian design consultancy, the one about the allocation of tasks to different designers and so on. And they delighted me by showing me theirs. So this is their computer-based system for the allocation of tasks within their studio. But the bottom line of what they were doing was not maximum company profit, but making sure that each member of the studio had their individual financial needs met. It was about the apportioning of work for their respective living costs. So they were appropriating zombie design tools in order to function equitably in their pirate work. Further, they're asking, what cultural design do we want to work in and support? Now, sometimes this design culture model can be used as an analytical tool to explore these kinds of questions. And I ran a workshop a couple of years ago in Colombia with a group of PhD students and design professionals, where I used this model to unpack, in a sense, what was happening in Colombia. I should quickly say that these Latin American examples, I think we've got a lot more to learn from them than we've got to take there, a huge amount. Oh, I should say also that this group insisted that we change the C of consumption to the S of society. My fourth example comes from the city of Kolding in southern Denmark, where I'm visiting professor. Now, Kolding has built its economy around logistics. It has been a strong importation hub for that section of Europe. However, in this long-term recession, not a lot's moving. And this has effectively undermined the basis of the city's economy for quite a while now. So you go into the city centre, you find all kinds of to let signs in front of shops which have just been emptied out. Also, the effect of the catastrophic decision to build an out-of-town shopping centre as well. But not to be deterred, the City Council at the end of 2012, after a very long consultation period, decided that it was time to move on and to, in a sense, reinvent the city. So they've set themselves at the 20-year task of becoming a design city under the rubric of We Design Life. Now, within that then, they're focusing on social innovation, on education and entrepreneurship as the cornerstones of this kind of process, which neatly maps onto my design culture diagram as well, with the sort of design and branding in the middle. And by design and branding, I don't mean sort of logos and other sort of visual communication forms and so on. It's really about a sort of longer term about design process, I suppose, and how these can be embedded into the city's education system, into its social innovation processes, and into its entrepreneurship. So I've been involved in, over the last year or so, running one or two workshops with various actors from the city in filling the gaps between these 3 points on the diagram, building a discussion about, well, you have the vision for this design city, but what's the design? How do you fill in this? How do we design life? So here, design culture involves a critical, insightful and detailed analysis of what is already there. We might then engage in small-scale reorientations of parts of it, paying attention to how this affects the relationships between these. This is a precarious activity, but there again, so is the design profession, as we've already seen. And it isn't that precarious compared with the wider economic, social and environmental context in which we're working. But just as a footnote to this idea of the zombies and pirates, the photograph used for the publicity for this lecture is by Dane Anna Amerson, who's a member of a design activist collective in Denmark. And it neatly illustrates the meeting of zombie and pirate design, not just in the conjunction of this shipping containers and ephemeral structures made from reclaimed materials. It also shows the meeting of mainstream city planning and social action. The photo was taken in Godsbanen, I think they would say Gotbanen, an old freight yard in the heart of Aarhus, which has been transformed into a site of cultural production with theatre, dance, film and open public workshops, the space relies on bottom-up initiatives and citizen participation. The rise of the post-industrial city means that urban environments and their governance and use have to be rethought. I want to finish this lecture, though, with 4 suggestions for further consideration. 4 things to look out for and think about if we are to use design culture as an object of study, as an academic discipline, and as a sensibility for action. Let's first think about scale and the scale we want to work with and act on within a design culture. When we talk about the fit or relationships between systems of design, production and consumption, how is this conceived? Are we talking about homes? Are we talking about neighbourhoods, towns and cities, regions, nations, pan-national arrangements? And how do these different scales fit and nest together? At the same time, we need to debate what kinds of dynamics we want. The new economy has, since the 1990s, made us expect things to happen here and now, to reach our goals, whether it be weight loss or getting a degree quick. This has been achieved by various mechanisms that bring design, production and consumption ever closer together. But we can ask ourselves, what benefits do we want from this constellation? What do we need in order to produce different dynamics, relationships and speeds between these nodes? And if design culture is in a constant state of becoming, in what direction is that becoming orientated? What do we want it and ourselves to become? Thirdly, we have to think more about materiality. My colleague, Professor Jonathan Chapman, and I were giving a talk to a group of bankers and minor aristocrats a few weeks ago. And Jonathan brilliantly observed that we live in a material world, and yet we are not materialistic enough. He meant that we don't appreciate and know the qualities of objects that fill our daily lives. And I'd extend this to our understanding of their provenance, the route they've taken to reach us, and their destinies. Further, I believe that we need also to understand more about the material and immaterial systems that we use. How are cycle sharing schemes configured? What arrangements of things and people make up our waste streams? How are our health clinics organised? And some of my work at the Victoria and Albert Museum is focused on thinking about how that institution engages with, collects and shows the design of services and systems rather than individual design objects. So finally, and relatedly, a new design culture should be knowing of itself and in itself. Now, by this, I look forward to these issues of scale, speed and materiality being made explicit through its own objects. In other words, our goods and services should be made more self-explanatory in terms of how they have come to be and why they are as they are. This isn't just because it's interesting. By knowing how design is functioning in society among all those who bring it into being through its making and use, we can participate in its critique and improvement. We should all be knowing social actors. In achieving these things, we have to be both analytical and generative. We have to ground our work in close observation while allowing imagination and creativity into our insights and actions. Design culture is a field of academic study, but also something that is produced and exists in the world. It's also something that we make. And in view of this, I just want to finish this talk with words which are not my own, but those of the, now wait for this, Indigenous Revolutionary Clandestine Committee of the 6th Commission of the Zapatista National Liberation Army in Mexico. Now these words were uttered or recorded precisely on the same night that Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. In other words, on the night that the global financial crisis unraveled. That was the night of the 15th of the 16th of September. And the words go as follows. If there's not a place for us in this world, another world must be made. What is missing is yet to come. Thank you very much and have a great Christmas.